Thanks, Carol, and thanks everyone for that singing today on this Easter Sunday. Easter's a great time of year, isn't it? For a whole lot of reasons. One being that hopefully the weather gets a little nicer this time of year. Hopefully it warms up. And springtime is upon us. We're praying the rain will hold off today because we're having the Beaches Easter Parade. We're taking part in that. And I want to stay dry. It's a little bit of a selfish prayer as I'm walking down the road. And I hope that many of you will be out there for it as well. It's good, again, to see you all here. My name is Tim Strickland. I serve as pastor here at Waverley Road Baptist Church. I've been here now almost a year since we moved back from, we were living in Alberta, but I grew up here in the city, was born in Scarborough, and it's good to be just back this year in my home city, not the least because it stays cold for a month longer in Alberta than it does in Ontario. If you've watched the news, you've seen snowstorms over there, and I'm so glad I'm not there enjoying those storms, but instead it's suffering through 10-degree weather today. Easter's a fun time, and we talk to the kids about that, and I remember when I was a kid, I went to church, we would have the church service, but let's be honest, when you're a kid, you're excited about one thing on Easter. The chocolate, right? The Easter bunny, the whole bit. And you were excited, and my mom and dad, they would hide chocolate Easter eggs in the house. Can you imagine that? They would hide them around our house. Did your parents do that? Some of them did. Some of you do that right now. And I would go with my brothers and we would find these chocolate Easter eggs. But there was a highlight. There was something that I remember even more than that. There was this special egg that Mom would get us. It was this yellow box. I've got a picture of this on the screen, Chris, if you can throw it up. This is important. I wanted you to see it. Do you know what this is? Who knows what this is? Put up your hand. Come on. This is a genuine Laura Secord chocolate egg. I don't know where Laura Secord went. I don't know what happened. But can you still get these? You did. You gotta get me one. These eggs. Mom would get these eggs, and they must be the most dangerous thing in the world with what's inside of them, because they are just so good. There's a rule in life about food that the better it tastes, the worse it is for you. You know that rule? This thing tastes so good, it must be really bad for you. It is just filled with cream and just beautiful stuff. And I would go and put it in the fridge. You couldn't eat this all at once or it would kill you. You had to eat it in stages. And so I would put it in the fridge, and I would cut it slice by slice, and I would eat slice, and then I'd eat another slice, and you couldn't eat it all at once. And not too long after Easter, the cream egg would be gone. And that's one of my best memories of growing up in my family of Easter, eating those eggs. And I'm glad to hear they're still around. I got to look around, and maybe there'll be a discount. I can get 2 or something. But as we look at Easter, of course, that's not what it's all about. That's a fun part of the way we celebrate it in our culture. But the reason we have Easter is because of Jesus Christ and what happened 2,000 years ago. But many people today are not so sure about what happened 2,000 years ago. There's a lot of questions surrounding the life of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, the work of Jesus. And the question really being asked by some is, did the resurrection really happen? Now maybe you're here today and you're saying, well, yeah, actually I'd kind of like to know if it really happened. Maybe you've asked that question before yourself. Maybe you've asked it out loud and told everybody in your family, look, I'm going to church today, but I'm not sure this really happened. And if that's you, then I'm really glad you're here because we're asking the question you're asking. Maybe you've thought it privately inside, but you thought, I don't really want to ask this because that might not be, polite enough to ask, especially on Easter Sunday of all days. But you still ask that, and again, I'm glad you're here. Maybe you've never thought about it a lot. You've just kind of been told it happened, and figured, well, I guess something must have happened. I'm glad you're here as well. And wherever you're at on this question, I'm glad you're here. I think it's important when you look at Christianity to recognize that it's a very unique faith in that it makes claims about history. It's not just a body of teachings or ideas or a spiritual feeling of some kind. It actually makes claims that events happened in history where God actually entered into history in the person of Jesus Christ, and that changed the course of history. It makes claims around Easter that he died on a cross and then that he miraculously rose from the grave. Things that we don't see happening every day, things that are unique and strange, and otherwise we'd say that couldn't have happened. And yet Christianity says these things actually happened. And because it makes claims about history, I believe that we should be able to test those claims and see whether it's reasonable to believe these things. I mentioned last week that I used to love it growing up when I went to church, when the speaker would come who would give a defense of the Christian faith and give reasons why these things might have happened. And so I like to continue that in my own preaching, because to me it matters whether or not these things actually happened. If it's just nice thoughts and nice ideas and a body of gentle, helpful teachings, but it didn't really happen, then I'm not interested. I mean, if that's what really happened, then we should sell the building and put up another condo, right? I mean, that's what a lot of churches have done. And I think some of the reason why it's happened is because people never address these things. And many people think, well, I'm a modern, I'm a 21st century person. I mean, maybe back a couple hundred years ago, people could believe in a resurrection. But, I mean, we live in a modern scientific world, and I just can't believe that. And churches didn't address these questions. They said, well, you shouldn't be asking that question. I mean, there's stories of people who they were kids in church, and they said, well, how did that really happen? And the teacher said, oh, don't worry about that. You just need to believe it. What kind of answer is that? And yet that's the answer many people were given, and it's no wonder they left the church. I believe that there should be answers to these questions. If we make claims in history, we should be able to have something to at least back it up. And today, I hope, as we look at this question, did the resurrection really happen? You'll see that I think there is some good reasons to believe it happened, but I'm going to present them for you. I'm going to try and present what some of the skeptics say as well, because it's one thing to hear one side of an argument, but I'd like to show you that there are responses, and you can see what some of the common responses are, and then you can think about it for yourself, and I hope it's an encouragement to you. I do want to read a passage out of the Bible. I realize that maybe some of you aren't sure if you believe the Bible or not, but I just want us to read it together, and even if you're not sure about it, consider it as one person's witness to what they say happened. This is from Luke, who was an associate of the famous Apostle Paul. It says in Luke 24, but on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. And they found a stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, why do you seek the living among the dead? Isn't that a good question, by the way? Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. And we'll pause our reading there. Now, if we were going to show or try and prove that this really happened, what would we do? How would we go about that? Well, let me ask you, how do you go about proving anything in history? This is actually something that courts of law do all the time, because a court of law is trying to show what happened historically. It might be near history, or it might be further back, depending on the case. But what do? Well, somebody says, I think this happened. They make an accusation of some kind. And then they present evidence saying these are the reasons why we believe these are the events that happened. That's routine. We read about it in the newspaper all the time. And when it comes to history, we do similar things. We gather evidence to try and support what we believe happened. Either there's enough evidence or there isn't enough evidence. I believe that's a reasonable way to look at anything, including looking at the resurrection. And what I want to share with you this morning is an approach to looking at the resurrection that was developed by Mike Licona and Gary Habermas. They're scholars who wrote a book called The Case for the Resurrection. This is the book here. I have a copy in my bag as well. I found it to be a really good book. I've actually met Gary Habermas a few years ago, and he's an interesting guy. He loves hockey too, so I appreciate that about him as well. But nonetheless, they wanted to present this in a way that would be not just acceptable to people who already believe, but which would challenge people who aren't sure what they believe or who maybe are skeptical about the resurrection. And they developed what they called the minimalist facts approach to looking at the resurrection. And what they did is they looked at scholarly works and they found 5 facts that are supported by most scholars. I won't say every single one, there's always differences of opinion, but the vast majority of scholars would agree with these facts. So these are things that, whether they're scholars who are believers in the Bible or whether they're just critical scholars studying the history of the Bible and other ancient sources, these are things that they would all agree are events of history, or most of them would agree, in the 90 percentile range for most of them, or higher. And they did this because they realized that many people, if you just say, well, you should believe it because the Bible says, many people would say, well, I don't believe the Bible, so I'm not going to believe it just because the Bible says. Instead, they wanted to get facts that they may be attested in the Bible, but they're accepted by, again, the vast majority of scholars. And I found this a really interesting approach to it. And so I want to share that with you this morning. The first minimalist fact that Habermas and Licona put together, again, that is widely accepted by the vast majority of scholars, is that Jesus died by crucifixion. The timing of that is generally dated to 30 AD, although some think 33 AD, but right there near the beginning of the 1st century. Now you may be surprised when I say that that's something that most scholars accept, because when you look at what people are saying today, when you talk to the average person out there, many wonder if Jesus, did he really exist or not, let alone was he really crucified or not. And they're actually surprised to find out that the vast majority of scholars have no doubt really at all about whether or not Jesus existed. You may want to check that out more yourself, but you'll find that in scholarly circles there's no real debate about the existence of Jesus or about the fact that he was crucified. I have a quote here in my notes from John Dominic Crossan. I quoted this last week and I think I'll share that again. John Dominic Crossan, he's a skeptical scholar. He's not known for his faith in Jesus, but he writes that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical will ever be. So Habermas and Licona start off, their first minimal fact is that Jesus indeed was crucified. That's widely accepted in scholarship. The second fact that they put forward is that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. Now that's not saying that everyone believes that he actually did, but it's saying that those who were his disciples genuinely believed that Jesus rose again, and they genuinely believed that they saw him alive. Now why would we say that? Well, all the evidence we have shows that from an early time, there was a radical change that happened. This small group, starting in Jerusalem and expanding around the world, went around telling everybody they could about this man named Jesus who had died and rose again, and who was actually God in the flesh, who needed to be worshipped that way. And the pages of history simply show us that is what happened. And these guys, they did this at great personal cost, giving up what their professions were before in many cases, and going in a world that was not friendly. They didn't live in a nice Canadian society with human rights and the rest of it, where you could believe whatever you want and basically say almost anything you want about religion, and you're free to do so. They didn't live in that kind of world. They lived in a world where if they said the wrong thing, they could kill you, they could persecute you and attack you, and nobody would protect you. And yet, despite that, these guys went around, and just about every single one of Jesus' disciples died a martyr's death, John being the exception. He ended up living in exile at the end of his life and faced persecution as well. But they all faced this persecution and death for what they believed. So scholars have come to say, as they look at this, that it's not very likely that these guys saw nothing or that they made it up or something like that. These guys genuinely believed. And it's a little different from, you might say, well, lots of people believe silly things, right? Have you ever believed something silly? I mean, lots of people have. The difference with these guys is they're not believing something that somebody else told them. They're believing something that they actually saw with their own eyes. They're primary witnesses. And so the weight of modern scholarship is simply that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. For example, I have a quote from Paula Fredrickson of Boston University. This is what she says. "I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attest to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as a historian they must have seen something." I like that. I don't know what they saw, but they must have seen something. So the second minimalist fact is that the disciples believed they saw the risen Christ. The third minimalist fact is that the great persecutor Paul, he was known as Saul and then he became known as Paul, was suddenly changed. Today we still use the phrase, when somebody makes a dramatic change because of something that happens in their life, we say they had what? A Damascus Road experience. Have you heard that figure of speech? It refers back to Paul, who literally had a Damascus Road experience. And again, scholars accept this as well attested in ancient history, that Paul started off as a persecutor of the Christian faith, and then abruptly he was transformed into a great champion of the Christian faith. Now, I thought about this, and in modern times, this would be something like if Richard Dawkins, you've heard of him, the famous atheist, if he were to announce tomorrow, "Hey, guess what? I now believe in Jesus, and I've decided to become a missionary." It's, what? You're the guy who wrote The God Delusion, who said that people believe in God are crazy or worse. I mean, you're, what? That's what it was like for Paul to convert. Maybe in politics, it would be like Stephen Harper saying, "You know what? I think I'm going to join the NDP. I've learned the error of my ways. I'm going to raise taxes. I'm going to spend wildly." And that was a political statement, wasn't it? I better be careful here. My point is that would be crazy. We'd say, I don't know if we want the old guy back or not, but we'd say, what happened? That's what happened when Paul converted. And what scholars say is that this was a radical change, and something dramatic had to happen for this change to take place. And what they all would point to is his claim again that he saw the risen Jesus. That's the reason given for why he did it. That's another piece of evidence. The fourth minimalist fact is probably the one that hits me the most. I don't actually think it's the strongest of the five facts, if you just look at it objectively, but it's the one that grabs me the most, and I'll explain why. It's the conversion of the skeptic James, who was also the brother, or half-brother, of Jesus. Jesus had, I believe, at least 4 brothers who were mentioned in the scriptures, as well as unnamed sisters. And he would have been the oldest of the bunch. And the reason this one grabs me is because it's about a brother. Jesus' brother, who was a skeptic, who during Jesus' ministry did not believe in him, all of a sudden becomes a strong believer. In fact, he becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. What happened? And the reason this gets me is I thought, what would it take to get my brother to believe I was God? Think about that for a minute. I got 2 younger brothers, so that's why and I don't normally think about this. I don't want them to think that. But if I was so inclined, what would I have to do to convince my brothers that I was God? I mean, how many times would I have to walk on the water? How many, 5,000 would I have to feed? How many lame would have to walk? How many dead would have to rise to convince your brothers that you were God? I'm not sure there is any number that could convince my brothers of that. Think of that for yourself. Maybe you're the oldest in your family. What would it take you to convince your brothers and your sisters that you were God? What would it take for you to be convinced that your older brother or sister was God? It's one thing to convince a other people, but your family, your brother? Come on. I mean, if I wanted to convince them that I was, a self-righteous hypocrite who wanted them to bear allegiance to me, and you must do it now, convince them I was a jerk, basically, that would be easy, right? I could convince my brothers of that very quickly, because they grew up with me, and they saw the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's why I find this one, again, I think just emotionally, it's like, if his own brother was convinced, that says something. And again, it's a radical change, and the reason given for why he changed is that he saw Jesus alive after he had been crucified. That's the fourth minimalist fact. And then the fifth one is that the tomb was empty. That's the tomb where they put the body of Jesus. In fact, from right the earliest times, one of the claims to counter the resurrection was that the disciples stole the body. Now that attack presupposes that the tomb was empty. Because you can't say they stole the body. If it was in there, there'd be no point in saying that. The resurrection was first proclaimed in what city? Does anybody know? Jerusalem. There in Israel. What city did Jesus die in? Jerusalem. There in Israel. If you are going to proclaim that somebody is resurrected, it's better to do it far away from where they died. Go far away where nobody will know. But if you do it right in the place where he died and his body is sitting in the tomb, what would the critics do? They'd take a walk to the grave. They'd say, actually, here's the grave right here. If you don't keep talking about it, if you don't stop talking about it, we're going to open the grave, we're going to show you the body's right in there. But nobody did that because right from the beginning, the tomb was empty. Now, I do want to make a qualifier here for this minimalist fact. The first four, it's going to be in the 90 percentile or above range of scholars who would agree with those. This one is around the 75% range, so it's not as strong as the other facts. I want to qualify that. Nonetheless, 75% isn't too shabby. It's believed by many, many scholars, again, that the tomb was empty. So as you look at these five facts, that Jesus was crucified, that his disciples genuinely believed they saw Jesus alive after he'd risen, that Paul made that dramatic conversion, that James made the dramatic conversion, both because they claimed to see Jesus, and then the tomb was actually empty, you're actually left with a pretty strong historical case. In fact, you're left with something stronger than many other things that we take for granted in ancient history. So what you need to say is, well, how do I account for these things? Is the resurrection the best way to account for these things? Does that account for disciples claiming to see the risen Christ and believing it? Well, it would account for it. Does it account for the conversion of Paul? Well, that would account for it. What about the conversion of James? That would account for it. What about the empty tomb? Well, that would account for it. When you look at them, they're actually pretty serious historical facts. But you might be saying, whoa, wait a second, somebody smart has thought about this and refuted this, right? Well, you could go home and Google it. But why don't I share some of these explanations with you? You can still go home and Google it, but I'll share some that are given by skeptics today to respond to these kind of things. Because there are alternative theories, because people who see, and right now some of you might be thinking, well, I never even thought I had to even deal with this. I just thought it was like a fairy tale. But the reality is, when you look at history, there's actually real reasons to believe this stuff. And you've got to take it seriously. And I think one of the great mistakes of our modern Western culture is simply to ignore history, to ignore these things and not even try and deal with it. At least some of the skeptics have taken the time to actually look into it and try and refute it. Many people just assume it's not there, don't even look at it. I encourage you to look at it. Let's look at what some of the skeptics say. Well, one thing they say to explain the resurrection, I already mentioned it, is that the disciples stole the body. This one actually has very little scholarly support, but it is still one that sometimes is mentioned in popular discussion. The idea is that the disciples, they're sad Jesus died, and thought, well, we don't want him to die, we really liked him. and we don't want his teaching to die, so we will steal the body, and then we'll say that he rose again, because he claimed he would rise again, so we'll say that, and then everyone will believe it, because people will believe anything, and that's how Christianity will get going. Now, the problem with this theory, I think the biggest problem, is that it assumes that these guys would make a gross lie and then, for the rest of their lives, proclaim it everywhere they went to the point of death. It would be one thing if they had fame and fortune and money to gain from this, but they actually didn't have anything to gain from this. It was really bad for them personally, if you look at what happened to them. And if this were true, we'd have to believe that not one of them cracked, but they went all through their entire lifetime making these claims and then being killed and dying and never recanting. That just simply stretches the imagination to think that at least a few of them wouldn't have cracked, or all of them, or that they would even do that in the first place. And so, again, that theory is pretty much discredited. There really isn't much scholarly support for it. Well, the second one, another theory, is that it's called the swoon theory. I like that word, swoon. It's not a word we use too often. That's a theory that Jesus didn't really die. You know, he was crucified, and he was maybe close to being dead, or went unconscious, and then they didn't notice he wasn't dead because they weren't very smart, and they took him off, and then he was revived. He got over it. Oh, that was tough. And he was okay then. That's one of the theories. He didn't really die. I call it the Monty Python theory of the resurrection. You know, he's not dead yet. He's getting better. You know what I mean? If you don't, that's okay. It's this idea that he wasn't really dead. People who say that have no idea what Roman crucifixion was all about. Crucifixion was a common form of capital punishment, brutal and effective, practiced by the Romans. A Roman soldier could die if he let somebody get away. The Romans knew how to kill people, is what I'm trying to say. And crucifixion was designed to kill people. The beating you got before you were crucified actually killed many people before they even got on the cross. To think that the Romans were so pathetic as to not, for some reason, know how to crucify Jesus is just to ignore history and the reality. They knew exactly how to crucify people, and if you got crucified, you died. It's a brutal, awful form of death. And even if you somehow grant that despite the fact that the Romans were good at this, they somehow blew it anyways, then you're left with a half-dead risen Jesus, which would not have made anybody worship him as God. It would have made people run for a doctor and say, "Are you okay?" But it wouldn't have produced Christianity, because no one would have said, "Wow, he rose from the grave." They would have said, "Oh, what a mess you are. Your body's beat to a pulp." And I mean, it's just a crazy thought. And again, this one has very little scholarly support today. Another suggestion is, well, maybe they were hallucinating. Maybe the original witnesses, they had a hallucination. They wanted Jesus to be alive, and then they hallucinated and thought they saw him, and then they started telling everybody, and they all got into kind of mass hysteria, and off it went. Well, again, there's real problems with this theory, and the basic one that I think most of us could think about without too much thought is that when you hallucinate, it's one thing if I have a hallucination and I tell you, "Hey, I had a hallucination, guess what I saw?" And you might say, "Okay, I guess that's what happened, you saw something." But if we all have a hallucination about the same thing, you'd say, "No, that's not how hallucination works, because it's a subjective thing that is for each person. You don't all see exactly the same thing at the same time multiple times," which is what the witness of those early people who claimed they saw Jesus risen would be. It just doesn't make sense that they all had the same hallucinations at the same time on multiple occasions. If you ask somebody who's an expert on hallucinations, they're going to tell you that's just not how hallucinations work. So that theory really, again, doesn't stand up much. The last two, I think, are the most popular today. And they're related, I think. The one is that the resurrection account was a legendary development. The idea of this is that, and originally, they're sad that Jesus died, and over time, decades, even 100 years or more, eventually somebody kind of reports that actually he rose again. And everybody says, yeah, that's what happened. And it's a legend. You understand what a legend is. It's something that over time, a story that kind of twists and grows and becomes something that we tell as if it's true, but we can't trace it back to its historical roots. That's what many people believe happened with the resurrection. The problem with that is that the evidence that we have that talk about the resurrection, it doesn't suddenly appear 100 years after Jesus lived. It appears very much within the lifetime of the witnesses. In fact, there's one ancient creed. It's given by Paul in the biblical book of 1 Corinthians. Now, again, before you say, hey, I don't believe the Bible, don't quote me the Bible, understand that 1 Corinthians, scholars, whether they believe the Bible or not, accept it was written by Paul, accept it as authentic, and it's generally accepted that this creed given in 1 Corinthians is authentic. Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. What does that phrase mean? It says, I'm telling you something that was given to me. It's a formal introduction to a creedal statement. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. That he was buried. That he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. The book of 1 Corinthians is dated around 51 AD. That's about 21 years after when Jesus died and resurrected. And Paul said not that he was writing that for the first time there, but that he had already given this to the Corinthians and he had received it before. And scholarly consensus is that he received this close to the time shortly after when Jesus died, probably about 5 years after. That would put it at AD 35. What that means is that we have an ancient creed dating back to within 5 years of the death and resurrection of Jesus. If you're going to argue for legendary development, you have a major problem. Because if you're arguing for a legend, there should be no mention of resurrection until decades and hundreds of years later. Because it's easy to make a legend when everybody's dead. But it's hard to make a legend when everybody's alive. Because people just refute it and say, no, that's not what happened. And so we have the ancient creed as well as the testimony of other sources that all point towards the resurrection being a very early development. But that one does carry some weight with people today. I don't think there's any merit in it. You need to consider what you think for yourself. The last one is that resurrections are impossible, so it didn't happen. This one could be called the short circuit theory, because it short circuits the evidence. And many people actually go with this one. This is their bottom line. They say, I don't care if you rise from the grave in front of me. It doesn't happen. Resurrections are impossible. This comes out of the work of the philosopher David Hume, who many years ago wrote and claimed to have proven that miracles cannot happen. Therefore, if you see a miracle, it didn't happen. Now, let me ask you, would you like it if a court of law took that approach to your case? You went into court and said, my neighbor, they stole something from me and they won't give it back. And the courtroom said, I don't believe in theft. The judge said, I don't believe in theft, especially by a nice neighbor like your neighbor. Therefore, it didn't happen. And you said, but I got evidence. I got a video camera by my house watching them go and grab my lawnmower and take it and smile at me and he said, and the judge said, I don't care, I don't believe in theft. You'd say, this is rigged, this isn't fair. I don't care what you believe in, you need to actually look at the evidence. And yet this is the bottom line for many skeptics today. I don't believe in a resurrection, I don't believe in miracles, therefore I don't care how much evidence you give me, you're never going to prove to me that Jesus rose from the grave. And you're left with quotes like the one I read by that scholar a few minutes ago where she says, I don't know what they saw. They must have seen something. But she's not willing to admit they might have actually seen the risen Christ. That one of all of them is the one I think that gets me the most, it bothers me the most, because I think we need to be fair. I think we need to look at the evidence. Now, if you're not convinced by the evidence, that's fine. At least you've taken a look. I wish you would be, but at least you've looked. But if you just say, I'm not going to consider the evidence because I've already decided in advance, then what are you doing? You're making a faith statement. You're saying, by faith I believe that miracles are impossible, or by David Hume, however you want to say it. I believe that philosophical statement in advance, and thus if you show me evidence, I will ignore it because I've made a philosophical belief that rises above any evidence you may show me. Isn't that ironic? Because that's what skeptics actually accuse Christians of doing. They say, you people take this stuff on faith without looking at the evidence. And yet here we are, I've shown you, there's reasonable evidence. Do you still have to take some step of faith to believe in the resurrection? Well, of course. It's a miraculous event. It's an unusual thing. But it's not a faith that is just a jump into the dark, a jump over a cliff. It's what William Lane Craig has called a reasonable faith. I feel many times it's the skeptics who are taking the jump in the dark. And I wish they wouldn't do that, because many of these people, they're brilliant people. They're not dumb people. And yet when it comes to this, they just say no. And sometimes I wonder, maybe it's because of the implications behind Christianity. If it's true, that has a whole mess of implications, doesn't it, that most of us don't want. And so it's better just to have a philosophical bias against it in the first place than to deal with what might actually happen. Well, that's the next question. What do we do with the resurrection? What do we do with it? I wonder where you're at today. Maybe you came in here and maybe you're with that philosophical bias saying, I don't believe in resurrections, I don't believe in miracles, I don't believe in walking on water or anything like that. And I just can't believe that. What I'm hoping today is that you've moved. Now, I'd love to see you move like 180 degrees, but maybe you've moved 30 degrees. From there's no way it happened to, well, I guess maybe it could have happened. If that's happened, then I feel like we've had a win today. Maybe you're at it probably didn't happen when you came in and you've moved to, well, it might have actually happened. Again, if that's where you've gone, that's a win today. Maybe you were somewhere in the middle and you've gone to saying, you know what, I think this actually happened. That's a win too. What do you do with that, though? What I'd ask you to ask in your heart is, say, what's holding me back here? What's holding me back here? Because for some of you, it may not actually be the evidence and the scientific and historical reasons that are holding you back. It could be all kinds of other things. You know, if I believe this, I'm going to have to admit my spouse is right. There's one that you don't want to do, right? If I believe this, God's going to make my life miserable and I won't be able to do the fun things I want to do. A lot of people think that, don't they? That's the real issue. If I believe this, my coworkers are going to think I've gone off the deep end. Those are often the issues that are the issues behind the issues, right? Today we've looked at historical evidence, and I think it's reasonable. And I wouldn't want to see you miss out on God, miss out on knowing Jesus, because of some of these other reasons. There's a real freedom that comes when you let go of all these things and put trust in Jesus. Even in your mind, some of you right now, there's a struggle going on saying, don't listen to this guy, he's nuts, don't listen to the pastor. And I'm not a psychic guy, I can't look in your mind, I just know that some of you, that's what's going on. What is that? Is that you? Where's that coming from? I think most of us, if we're honest, we know there are spiritual realities in us. And there's spiritual fights that go on within us. Is that voice real? Yeah, it's real. Are you going to listen to that voice? There's another voice saying, no, you need to listen to this. You need to do something about this, and there's this fight within you. I'm inviting you to take a step. Not a blind leap, but a step of faith and put your trust in Jesus. No, I'm not asking you to, tighten your belt buckle, pull up your boots, and do better. A lot of you think he's just saying, I got to be religious now and do better and, memorize the Bible backwards and all that or something. That's not what I'm going for here. The gospel, or the good news of Jesus, is not about what you do. That comes as news to a lot of people. It's not about what you do. It's about what Jesus already did. God looked at the world and said, there's no way these people can save themselves. But most people in the world are trying to be good so they can save themselves. They think if I'm good enough for God, God will accept me. Because that's how a lot of things work in life. If I'm good enough for somebody, they'll accept me. If I'm bad, they won't. God said, I'm going to accept you regardless. And the only thing you got to do is trust in my Son to save you. And as human beings, there's part of us that hates that. Because if I am good enough, then God owes me, right? If I'm good enough, I can say, God, I'm good enough and you owe me. You've got to save me. But if I say I'm not good enough and I'm trusting in Jesus, then it's all by grace, isn't it? I'm not asking you to try and be better or become a, quote, religious person. We don't need more, quote, religious people in this world, trust me. We need people who know that they can't make it on their own, know that apart from God, they often do the wrong thing. We need people who know that about themselves and ask for forgiveness and say, I'm putting my trust in Jesus to save me. That's the message of Easter. Will you put your trust in Jesus? Again, I don't know where you came in today. I don't know where you're at now. But I hope God has moved you along somewhere along the path. How can you respond? I wrote some responses you could maybe do in your notes. You could maybe begin to explore Christianity. You might say, I'm not going to do this all in one day. That's fine, I get that. I want you to begin to explore and take the evidence seriously. Maybe you want to start attending church regularly to learn more about Jesus. You might want to seek out a pastor or a Christian friend. Maybe somebody invited you here. And ask more questions. You might want to join a small group in the church. We have groups that meet where you can discuss things further with other people. You'll probably want to pray and ask God to help you in your search. And God likes that kind of prayer. And if you say, how do I pray? Just talk to God in your head. Don't be fancy. Just talk to Him. He's good with that. And some of you may be at the point where you said, you know what, I've been fighting this for long enough. I need to place my trust in Jesus today. And you can do that by praying to God and saying, I'm sorry for the wrong things I've done. I'm trusting you to save me. I believe Jesus was resurrected and that His life can be mine. You can do that today. There's a couple verses that Paul, that famous apostle, wrote. He said that God shows His love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And then he wrote, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. That promise is as good today as it was 2,000 years ago. And wouldn't it be great to make this Easter Sunday your day of trusting in Jesus? I'm going to invite Carol and the team to come forward and we're going to sing a song. And I want you to reflect on what you've heard, even as you sing, as we all sing together.